I'm Mary Lyons, the Wealth Woman.
I'm Eric Alexander with Acorn Grove.
Welcome to the Wealth and Income Podcast. We have what I think is an exciting episode. I feel like I always tee them up this way, but I think this is
amazing ever.
Yeah, stay tuned. It's going to be amazing. So I'll actually, before I tee it up. So I went to a conference last week and it was an industry conference. And I always feel like doing that kind of thing is a mixed bag because you never know what you're going to get. You don't know what the speakers are going to say. You don't know what their perspectives are going to be, whether or not their philosophies are similar to yours. But I always feel like you get a couple of nuggets. Maybe you meet a couple of people that change your perspective or bring you back to a prior perspective in a way that's helpful. And that kind of just the summary of that and talking through that conference, I think kind of led us to this topic. And the topic is really centered around the idea of protection first. We spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about maximizing income and the productivity of the dollars that are at work for you. But ultimately, if you don't build the moat around your castle, then anybody can raid it, right? Half of our job, I think, is protecting what our clients are building, or at least showing them how to protect it so that when things go wrong financially, their world doesn't implode. And I think that's key because most of us get excited about opportunity. We tend to focus on, growth. It's exciting. And talking about risk and all the way things go wrong can be scary because to some degree, we feel like if we focus on it, it's going to happen. So it's better just to pretend it doesn't. I guess hope is a strategy. It's just not a very good one. Plan only works when everything goes correctly. That's not great. So I want to spend a little bit of time today with that protection first mindset, which is not super popular in most investment circles, but I think it's incredibly necessary.
Yeah, well, there's a number of reasons I'm not an attorney. There's 1,000 of them, but one of the main ones is I don't want to be everybody's wet blanket. This is where you're going to die. This is where you're going to go wrong. So you're right. Nobody wants to come in to these conversations figuring out where it all goes wrong. If we figure out
all the worst case scenarios you can think of.
But if we figure out where it all goes wrong and you put in a couple of things in place so that if it does, you're in a better spot, or at least not in a worse spot, then it's worth the 5 minutes of,
It's worth the pain because then it's hypothetical pain instead of, unfortunately, real pain that we see people experience sometimes.
100%.
When I first got into this industry, there was a software program called LEAP, which stood for Lifetime Economic Acceleration Process. And that software still exists today. It still does the things it did before. And we use a different software program that, in my opinion, is sort of the evolution of where LEAP started. But, the thing that I loved about that particular model is that it prioritized first protection, then savings, and then growth. It wasn't lean in and take all the risk right off the bat because if you lose it, you have time to recover. It was go ahead and get the protection in, then build your safety net first, and then take risk because then it becomes additive instead of gambling. And I feel like sometimes the visual representation we used, which was a series of boxes, and you would start and you would look at your car insurance and your homeowner's insurance, and then your wills and trusts, and then your disability insurance, and then your life insurance and your long-term care insurance, and all the things that are meant to protect you. That made so much sense to me. It was logical. I could check the box when it was done. And I think our conversations have changed to a focus on income creation and growth all the time. And I think that's actually dangerous. It is legitimately dangerous not to address how do I make sure that when things go wrong, financially, everything continues to go right.
Yeah, because people make terrible decisions in scarcity and fear, and you make very, very, very bad decisions in those moments.
And a lot of the moments that could be catastrophic are solvable. They're not that hard to deal with if you deal with them early, and they aren't really that expensive to deal with.
In comparison.
In comparison in particular. It requires us to make the hard grown-up decision. I can remember my parents always being like, you're going to be a grown-up for the rest of your life. Enjoy being a kid. And I think the phrase is youth is wasted on the young. I think sometimes even as adults, we don't want to make the hard decisions, but this is where I think when you don't, it becomes an issue.
Yep. I remember we came back from vacation one time and it was July and my wife was pregnant and the air conditioning died and it was $12,000 to fix it. And I'm like, this is the what? But what can I don't take anybody up into the attic and point to my brand new air conditioner, but I'm not going to have my pregnant wife baking in the house at 90 degrees. So, sometimes we have to adult and sometimes it sucks. So talk about life insurance because that's one of the ones that I think it is, and you mentioned it earlier. It is one of those catastrophic events, whether it's expected or unexpected, that can rock a family and can rock a family for a long time.
Yeah. And I've seen this in my own neighborhood where people didn't have what they needed. I think we've all had a moment where we're on social media and we see someone has a GoFundMe because a spouse died unexpectedly or prematurely. But somebody said something to me very recently, actually at this conference, and it really stuck with me, the way they phrased this, because it hits home. And it was, when you lose a breadwinner, whether there's a sole breadwinner or there is a husband and wife team or two partners, whatever it looks like. When you lose someone who is bringing in income for a household, emotional devastation doesn't have to mean financial devastation. But if you haven't planned accordingly, financial devastation will always mean emotional devastation. I think about that, and I'm going to go through actually just a quick example. Let's say we have a husband and a wife, mom's a nurse, dad's in construction. They both make about 80 grand a year. That's a household income of about 160,000 a year. They've saved up enough money. They've bought their first home. They've moved into a neighborhood where they're excited about the schools that they're going to send their kids to. Dad works 7 to 4, so he's home in time to coach the soccer team for his kiddos, right? Mom is a nurse. She's working different hours, right? But the two of them are making it happen. So mom is there in the morning to get the kids ready, get them to school, be a part of their lives. Dad is there to pick them up from school, coaching soccer. And you think about this life, they're there for their kids, they're present, life is moving forward, they're doing their savings, they have that emotional connection with each other and with the kids. But let's say something happens to mom and mom isn't there anymore. All of a sudden, their household income just went from $160,000 a year to $80,000 a year. Now that mortgage is not attainable, right? Dad's having a harder time because he's got to get the kids ready for school, so he's late to work. That's an issue. He is now in a position where because he's showing up late, he has to stay later, so he can't coach the kids anymore. He's devastated because his wife is not there, right? The kids are devastated because his wife is not there, but now dad's not there either because he can't coach anymore because he's got to take on extra work to keep the house. And then they end up maybe even having to sell the house because they can't stay in the neighborhood and they move somewhere else, and the kids are having to get a part-time job to help contribute. And this all sounds like, oh my gosh, how would that happen? But these are the things that happen to people in real life when they don't plan because they think their spouse is going to be there forever and they don't want to deal with the harder issues. And they're actually very solvable problems because as simple as it is, if they're in their 30s or 40s and they're working through there, all they need is enough life insurance in this situation to show up that it will throw off the income the other spouse was providing so that all the rest of life doesn't have to get disrupted. And I think there's a problem in our world right now where we look at needs-based planning and it's just how much money do you need to pay off the mortgage so that then they could keep the house. But the reality is, even if the house is paid off, the house wasn't $80,000 a year of expenses. So there's so many other things that get sacrificed when we plan for this idea of just, I don't need debt and then I'll be okay, as opposed to planning for if we are walking down the path of life hand in hand and something happens to your partner, do you want your world to be uprooted or do you want it at least financially to be the same? Because emotionally it will always be different. And I think sometimes people are like, I'll remarry. why do you want to put yourself into a position where you have to
Right.
in order to make things continue in a way that is sustainable?
And logistically, even if you're okay getting remarried, that's not a 4-week process. There's a lot of living that goes in between my spouse just died and I have a new spouse. So there's a lot of therapy. There's a lot of working through that. I mean, that's not an immediate deal. And do you want to get married to someone else because you need a paycheck? That is not the reason to get married.
Right.
100%.
So let's talk about this for a second, because I think, even if you're looking at it going, oh, I could totally get by. I mean, I think about even larger incomes. Again, the question goes back to, do you want to? Most of the decisions that I make in my life are not based on need. They're based on what I want. It's the idea of I'm going to work really hard so that I can do certain things. It's about building a life that's deliberate and intentional. It's about taking trips and building memories with the kids. It's about making sure that they have access to the things that they need that will allow them to be successful later in life. None of those are needs. If I think about needs, it's just making sure that I can feed myself and that I'm relatively safe on a day-to-day basis. But I haven't structured my life around that. I've structured my life around what do I want. And so when I think we get really honest with ourselves about what we want, it is, you have to make the decisions where you are not trading what you really want for what you want right now. And that means laying a very solid foundation for what happens in your future. And that happens when you approach your life with a protection first mentality. When we think about the life insurance question, I think there are only two questions. And the first is how much? The second is what kind? So, Eric, will you talk about the how much question here for a second?
Yeah, and I think you nailed it earlier. I think the traditional model for the how much looks like an index card with a couple numbers on it. How much do we need to send our kids to school? How much is the house? We need to pay this bill, A plus B plus C. You need X amount of dollars. But to your point, that completely destroys this idea of my mission. If I didn't show up for work the next day, is Amy's life and our boy's life look as close to the same as it did the day before as it does the day after. And that means I need income. I need income so that Amy gets to keep rocking and rolling. She's got safety to go make those choices. And so when you look through this idea of how much do I need to go recreate or get as close as I can to recreate that income, there's a concept called human economic value. And where they got that was wrongful death suits, and you stepped out and the Budweiser beer truck smashed into you and killed you. And how much does your significant other get from Budweiser or whoever, right? Whoever ran over your toe. How much did they get on the other side of that? And basically what they're doing is looking at, well, Bob made 100 grand, Sue made 100 grand, whoever got killed on that side made X dollars. And then they look at how much longer they had to go work, and they do some math, and they came up with this formula of basically what would it take to recreate the income that you're making right now so that you can be made whole again. And it's a conversation around what they call human economic value.
Yeah, it's the idea of what lump sum needs to show up right now to produce your income plus your career trajectory over the rest of your working lifetime. And that's really, if we oversimplify it, it is a multiple of your current income. So if you're in your 30s, it's 30 times your current income. So if Bob was 30 when he got hit by the truck, and he's making 100 grand a year, that means he needs about $3 million worth of life insurance coverage. And we know, because the safe withdrawal rates to produce income over a 30-year time period are really about 3%.
Right.
We know that he can spend about 90 grand a year if that $3 million shows up in a lump sum. And that will also allow him to create that and give himself like 3% raises each year to mimic what would have happened. And that should be no problem to maintain that particular income for his spouse over that time period. If you're in your 40s, it's just 20 times your income. And if you're in your 50s, it's about 10 times your income. When you're in your 60s, it's usually 5 times your income, or they'll match your net worth. And so the beauty of doing this when you're young is that even though that number might feel really big, if I'm making 100 grand a year, the likelihood that I have $3 million in my bank account right now is very small. Right. So sometimes there is this idea of, well, I don't want my spouse to win the lottery just because I die. And we aren't trying to create a situation where your spouse is profiting because you're not here. It's about maintaining what you were providing at that particular moment over what would have been the rest of your lifetime. And so I think there's that tendency to hear those numbers and go, gosh, that's so big. But if you're doing the math in your head right now on your income and you're like, dang, that's a lot of money, then what you really need to do is just pat yourself on the back and say, congratulations, I'm worth a boatload.
Well done at adulting.
Right. And understand that if you're putting numbers around what you are providing for your family, it's a lot more than you probably realize it is. You need to wrap your
1,000%.
arms around that. And I think that's such a big deal, because sometimes there's this idea of, oh, we can self-insure. I'm going to tell you, like, I would much rather, if my life goes totally wrong in the worst possible ways, I would rather know that everything is going to continue on financially exactly the way it is. And if I don't need to live as big of a lifestyle, then maybe I get to take a step back and be much more present for my children.
Who just lost their spouse or just lost their
parent, right? Like, you have to show up differently. And if you are worried about the money, then you are not there emotionally for your kids, and your whole family has a different experience than if you were able to actually be there for them, because you know that financially things are okay. And I think it allows you to remember your spouse differently as well, because there's a sense of gratitude for the fact that they took care of you, as opposed to anger and resentment that they did not make the choices they could have made. Because especially when you're in your 30s and 40s, if you're relatively healthy, the cost of insurance is not generally more than the cost of your cell phone. So if you want that little picture taker for all of those beautiful memories, then you need to make sure that you get to keep the rest of your memories intact too, because they're still seen through the light of love versus the other direction. And here I go getting all woo-woo again, but these things matter. And I think it matters beyond just saying this is the choice you make when you love somebody. I think this is about, I think about the vows I took, and I got to go to a wedding this weekend. So I'm like in this place where all this is fresh up.
Very woo-woo today. That's all.
Very much so. But, being at a wedding ceremony and getting to hear the vows and the promises that you were making when you were at that altar. I think sometimes in our day-to-day life, we step back and we step away from that just a little bit. Not that we forget, but we forget the promises, specifically the promises that we made, not just the commitment to one another, but the promises we made. And this whole spot of taking care of somebody through sickness and health, and the commitment and how you are committing yourself to this other person, that to me, like, it comes back to that, knowing that I have made the choices in my life that no matter what happens to me, my spouse is taken care of. These decisions matter even before you have kids, or if you have kids.
Yeah. And what bigger love letter can you write?
It's about love. It's about responsibility. It's about all of those things. But, the fact that I can cover the cost of my insurance for a nice meal, I mean, which one matters? The nice meal, the new pair of sneakers, or making sure that if something goes terribly wrong, my spouse is taken care of for the rest of their lifetime, and so are my kids. I think sometimes we need to get very real with ourselves about what we're prioritizing. And I don't want this to come off as proselytizing, but I do feel like frequently we see people making choices that don't put them into the best possible position, either because they haven't confronted their own mortality, or there's something else they want right now, so they aren't contextualizing what's really important to them.
Well, and I think about our job some days as being the advocate for the 80-year-old that can't be in the room. Mm-hmm. And because we've been doing this for a long time, I've paid death claims. I've been there with a check on the worst days. And, the old joke, no widow ever complained the check was too big. But I've been there on those moments, and it's tough, and it happens, and nobody ever thought it would, because they were young and healthy, and you're making $100,000 and you need $300,000 or $3 million in insurance. And that seems like a lot. But man, if you didn't show up for work, wouldn't you want your spouse to get a really big check? If you had the worst day of your life, it's still the worst day of your life, but it's a little bit better because you have $3 million. Like, even if that seems like a massive amount of money, maybe that's okay, right? And your point about, I don't make good financial, long-term, cogent decisions when I am in emotional distress. and make
Right.
terrible decisions.
Because if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, I don't want my spouse to have $3 million that they can make a terrible decision with, put it in a trust. There's parameters around how it can be used and what it can be used for, all of those types of things. But I think those are conversations you can have as spouses and say, like, we are doing this because we care about each other. And if there are kids, we care about the kids as well. And the number could be much larger. I mean, it
100%.
just depends on what you have going on. But I look at that. And again, I think it's already going to be awful. At least this part doesn't have to be. And I think,
Well, yeah. And one caveat is a lot of times there's a non-working spouse. And so, and I'll pick on the wives because the wives are the ones that typically do this, right? If the wife is non-working, the husbands will take all they can get. It's the wives that are more selfless than the husbands. And the wife's like, well, I don't work outside the home. What do I need life insurance for? And I'm like, oh, come on. Like, you do a lot of stuff for this family that if you weren't here, your husband has to pay other people for.
right.
Picking up kids, making dinner, making lunches, loving on the kids, making sure everything's working. I mean, you are underpaid for the work that you're doing, grossly underpaid. And so I know you don't think you make a lot of money, but you have a tremendous amount of value, and don't ever discount that.
Well, and I'm going to add into that because I like to go to the facts. So most insurance companies will insure a non-working spouse for anywhere between 50 and 75% of the coverage that the working spouse has. So if you have a spouse that is getting, $3 million worth of coverage and you happen to stay at home, they will insure you for over 2 million in most cases, at least 1.5, but in most cases closer to 2.2, 2.3 because of the value you are providing in your own home. So if anyone is listening to that going, yeah, I don't need that. I do think sometimes too, we actually have a client who I remember saying, he's like, yeah, I'll figure it out. I make enough money. It's fine. But I think being able to have that be a reciprocal love letter matters, and to say, look, you take care of me, but I think it's important I take care of you too. There's other things that have to happen here. And I think it's just as important if you have two working members of a household as well, because that's that one you can see the math changing pretty dramatically, pretty quickly, right? The second question, the what kind question, is really a function of economics. And I think this is, I think if you look at term insurance is the cheapest way to get, or at least the least cash flow prohibitive way to get as much coverage as possible. And so I think that's where you start. And then the permanent coverage piece of that is really based on how does it fit into the overall financial strategy. And we have podcast upon podcast about how that works and balancing the permanent coverage, the whole life insurance with the investment side of the world to maximize income moving forward. But I think the first question has to be how much. And then the second question is what kind. And knowing that you can at least get a portion, or in some cases, all of your coverage to be permanent and part of the broader financial plan, I think is important as well. But most people end up with a mix of those two based on their individual situation.
Right.
And I do think sometimes when you're talking to people in the insurance industry, people are scared to ask, what kind of coverage should I have? Because they're afraid that the more expensive coverage will be recommended, and they don't know how to know if that's actually right for them. But I think fitting it into your financial model, knowing how it's going to impact your future income, and then looking at, do I have the right combination of term insurance and whole life insurance to protect my family, is key. And so if you are trying to figure out, how do I know what blend I should have, or if I have enough, then please feel free to reach out and ask us questions. Eric, if they are looking for you, where can they find you?
Yeah, you can find me at Acorn.
And if you're looking for me, I am at The Wealth Woman. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Specific financial concepts and advanced strategies are presented to you for educational purposes only. We cannot and do not guarantee their applicability to your individual circumstance. We encourage you to seek personalized advice from qualified professionals on all financial matters.
Provided content is for overview and is not intended and should not be relied upon as individualized tax, legal, fiduciary, or investment advice. Neither Wealth Woman, Acorn Grove, or the Wealth and Income Podcast, nor their representatives provide tax or legal advice. For answers to specific questions and before making any decision, Please consult a qualified attorney or tax advisors.
All numeric examples and any individual shown are hypothetical and were used for explanatory purposes only. Actual results may vary.
Investing involves risk, which includes potential loss of principal. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. Guarantees are subject to the claims paying ability of the issuing insurance company.
Life insurance should be purchased by individuals that have a need to provide a death benefit to protect others with insurable interests in their lives against financial loss. Life insurance is not a retirement plan, investment, or savings account.
Not affiliated with or endorsed by the Social Security Administration, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or any governmental agency. Insurance and investment products, not a deposit, not FDIC or NCUA insured, not insured by any federal government agency, not guaranteed by any bank or credit union, may lose value.
Please visit the Wealth Woman website disclosure page for other important disclosures.